Hey guys, I'm Matt Lighty, and today's video I want to talk about auto-exerting Warcrys. Now, Warcrys were revamped this patch, 3.25, in a couple of ways, and they did that by associating a automated way of triggering them called auto-exertion. We had a different method last patch, and before that something else, and there's been totally different support for how Warcrys operate. But there's some interesting things with auto-exerting that lend themselves to a viable playstyle, I think, because traditionally, I think realistically, auto-exerting is never better, because auto-exerting requires reservation. It does set the flat mana cost at a different threshold, which can be beneficial, but the reservation per Warcry being set at 15% is steep. And the downside of the increased cooldown, which means they have longer cooldowns, and they do not grant buffs or charges to you or allies. So that may sound catastrophic, but there actually is a lot of weird workarounds that still work for auto-exerting that make it what I would describe as a viable playstyle if you're feeling lazy. Because again, optimally, whether you're playing a slam build or a strike build, when you're warcrying, a large benefit of that is the exerted attack, which is a large amount of increased attack damage, on top of the benefits of what the Warcrys do, which are insane, depending on what they are, because you have things as insane as Seismic Warcry, which is a very large amount, 50% more AoE, or things like Ancestral Cry, meaning we can strike additional targets for effectively free. When you're scaling up things like Warcry Effect, that also can somehow bend the numbers up. If you had enough Warcry Effect, you can get an extra strike or more AoE or things like that. But what's classified as a buff and what isn't, and how the masteries and the thresholds interact with Warcrys, is what makes this so fascinating. So, this is a basic, what we'll say, slam build I have set up here. That again, the difference between it being a slam build and it being a strike build effectively is you swapping out Seismic for Ancestral. You can use both, but Seismic is specifically about slam skills. And then the secondary line says exert attacks have more AoE. I believe the AoE part will affect it, but Ancestral is specifically strike skills, which I think that's the distinction between the two. And there's some specialty Warcries like Infernal Cry for Corpse Explosion or Enduring Cry for charge generation and that sort of stuff, but this one is in direct opposition of auto-exerting because it grants you charges and then buffs, which again auto-exerting doesn't do. Things like Vengeful Cry is a retaliation skill, which it means the way it functions is totally separate from a traditional Warcry. And then you have also things like Corrupting Cry, which is a support that's used as its own kind of build for applying Corrupting Fever. Another one's General's Cry. This is used to animate corpses through Mirage Warriors that perform attacks you have linked to it. Those are kind of separate builds. Traditionally, you'll have Warcries either in an auto-exert setup, or if you're going to be, again, playing them better but way more active, i.e. pianoing your flasks, you're effectively using urgent orders in place of the auto-exertion. This makes it so your Warcries are not instant, their cast speed is quite high effectively, or their Warcry speed, because they're technically not spells, so they don't have a cast speed, they have a Warcry speed. This is a classic PoE distinction. So in a traditional setup, if you were to do this in a instance, your auto-exerting are going to be going off constantly in succession, doing a multiple of things, screaming at you as they all rotate. Now, they all have independent cooldowns through auto-exertion. Their cooldowns are triggered when their CDR ends, so they're looping about every second or so. It's also why the quality is so important, because aside from the auto-exertion portion, these are all active skills, meaning that you can't flip them traditionally through gems. You have to use either GCP or Lab to kind of get their quality up, which is annoying because the quality is so important, being CDR, increased cooldown recovery speed. Not only are you offsetting the negative CDR that the auto-exertion support applies, but there's just a large amount of CDR incorporated with it, not to mention the passivity has a ton as well. So this is your auto-exertion setup. Now you can see from my reservation, if I turn off Vitality here, it's reserving 15% of my life per aura, right, times a bunch, 55.56, and I have a little bit of aura reservation. So traditionally it'd be 60%. A tremendous amount of reservation is being allocated for something that is automated, but is effectively working worse in a normal setting. If we removed that, we're gaining large amounts of our effective mana pool back that could be put into doing something like, running a determination or a couple different auras. We could slap in urgent orders and then just physically click QWER to actually do them in succession. And it'll be in succession the same speed effectively, but a little bit faster than they'd be coming back up with auto-exerting. But the downside is, I have to click 4 fucking buttons every 2 seconds. And this is what's going to lead not so much the character to die, but more the player to die. Because if you have to push 4 keys every 2 seconds, you're going to get up from your computer and jump off a fucking building. Now, I've done this in hardcore and a little bit in softcore, and it's really, really good, but it's as intensive as you can imagine. Now, realistically, if you're not someone like me who's live or like streaming or doing YouTube stuff, you could fucking run a macro. It's against TOS, but, and there's ways you could do numlock macros to just hold down QWER so that they're just triggering constantly. That's against the rules. You'll get banned if you get caught, but we live in the world of humans, so your hands have a limited durability, so I get it. Now, alternatively, what you could legally do is you could put a Warcry on left click, and you're going to be able to trigger it effectively automatically, but it's going to cause you to stagger step. If you don't mind the constant stagger stepping of this occurring, feel free to just run one Warcry in urgent orders on your left click. And this can be used to do a lot of fun things in a way. Battle Mage's Cry has the exertion portion, but also because the exerted attacks trigger supported skills, this part is legally not a buff, meaning when you auto-exert it, this still applies. You could automate the popular thing being a curse. You'll see this in effect when you right-click after you've done a Battle Mage's Cry, which is on key R. Well, hello? I legally have to hit something for it to work. Let me go hit something to show you. I need a thing. Somebody give me a thing to hit. Okay, Battle Mage Cry. When I exert an attack, boom, it casts Vuln. It casts whatever spell you have hooked up to it. You could do not just curses, you could do things like Void Sphere, legally, or, any other spell you wanted to. But, yeah, that's what Battle Mage Cry does. It exerts an attack, meaning it grants more damage and exerts the property, and then also casts a, supported spell. Seismic is big amounts of AoE. The buff portion being armor and stun threshold is less important. It's really just the AoE is the real main factor. It's a 50% more multiplier. Rallying Cry is just a bunch of more exerted attacks, more damage. Just damage is good, damage is great. Intimidating exerts a bunch of attacks and also does double damage, which is nothing's better than doing double. I guess triple damage is better, but fantastic nonetheless. Then again, you have things like Ancestral, which exert a bunch of attacks if they're strikes. Kind of why I swap it out for the Slam one, but you get the idea. Now, there's also a support called auto-exertion. You can kind of see how insane this is. If you kind of assume a support, on average, is giving you between 30 and 35% more damage, over-exertion as a support is, like, the best support in the game for a build like this. Because you're exerting your thing 4 to 5 times, meaning it's like 60 to 70% more damage just for one support. Kind of hard to beat that. So we've kind of gone over what all of the different actual things do as far as Warcries, but here's the fun part, is when you're actually choosing to allocate that chunk of mana to auto-exert and have it automated, you could do a lot of fun things. One of those fun things is grant yourself permanent Valor increase for banners, large amounts of Valor to place as many banners as you want that have massive AoE, screen-wide AoE. Grant yourself permanent uptime on every charge, permanent Onslaught, 100% increased armor, high chance of double damage, permanent Intimidate, and a lot of this is just done through the magic of your exert clusters. This is like part of the kind of automated Warcry funness, because you could do a lot of goofy things that make this feel not so shit to just spend so much mana doing this. Now, there are a bunch of Warcry nodes on the tree, some of the cool ones being Admonisher, 15% increased damage for each time you've Warcried recently. This is interesting because what does it mean to Warcry recently if we're not the ones Warcrying the auto-exerting is? The buffs don't count, but sometimes they do. What are the rules? Well, there are a couple things. The wiki has the auto-exertion information because it's really interesting what legally qualifies. This is the part that's you have to really soak in. Triggering a Warcry does not count as using a Warcry for when the verbiage is very specific, saying when you use a Warcry. Now, when is that actually relevant? the second line on the mastery says recover 15% of life when you use a Warcry, right? So that one doesn't work with auto-exertion because we're not using a Warcry technically. But there's a weird distinction. It does count as Warcrying for when the verbiage is specifically when you Warcry. So not when you use a Warcry, but when you Warcry. Now, is this just a minor grammatical difference that, like, really shouldn't exist? 100%. Like, what the fuck? I understand why it exists, to have a distinction, but could there be a more confusing subset of micro rules? Possibly not. So when you use a Warcry, doesn't work with auto-exertion. When you Warcry, does. Okay? Also, having Warcried recently does work, because even though we haven't Warcried, a Warcry has occurred from us recently. So that also works. Now, what does that qualify for? Things like the Admonisher Anoint we have says, if you've Warcried recently. Well, technically, we're not the ones doing the Warcry, but we are, so this one works. That damage works for the when you've Warcried recently. There's a couple things like the Rage one. This one actually works if you look at this mastery up here. Grant Rage per 5 enemy power. So that's when we Warcrying, it's granting that if there's enemy power. Power is another weird thing that has a whole other bag of bones to go through, but the easy way to understand power is the more rare things near you of higher rarity, you get more power. But if you're a chieftain, you got this great little thing that says Warcries have infinite power. So you can see normal mobs have 1 power, magic mobs have 2, rares have 10, uniques have 20, and players have 5, and then it's per power, per thing, whatever. If you're a chieftain, it's infinite. If you use a red blade banner, that also makes it infinite. I don't really recommend using shields and slam builds, but if you wanted to, this one has Warcries have infinite power, the same as the chieftain, so you could do something with that. But back to the Warcries themselves. You have a lot of cool things like Warcry CDR. You have a lot of things like Warcries exert an extra attack, which is great, so that 2 for things like, intimidating becomes 3, right? There's even weapon bases that actually give you additional Warcries. But some of the masteries are pretty interesting. So Warcries cannot exert travel attack. So that's important because if I were to leap slam, it would exert that. Because leap slam is a slam. I don't want that. I want to pick this up as mastery, so not waste my exerts on my leap slam. You could also mastercraft this on your amulet if you want it. Recovering the life doesn't work with auto exert. Warcries have minimum power is something that's relevant, but not for us, because if we're a chieftain, we have infinite power, or use red blade banner, infinite power then. Warcries debilitate enemies for 1 second. This is always applicable. Now, Warcrying debilitating for 1 second is like kind of okay, because we're Warcrying every 4 seconds, but it's on a similar cooldown because they're not happening sequentially, right? But there is actually ways to make them happen sequentially if you wanted to. So right now we have all 4 Warcries going off at the same time, at the same interval. If we could just stagger them if we chose to. This is craziness, and I wouldn't recommend this, but if you really wanted to go extra psycho out there, you could do this and have it so your Warcries are kind of clockwise staggered at different intervals to ensure that 1 second is always up. Again, wouldn't recommend, but you legally can do that. If you as equally offset them by not having cooldown quality on them, that also would cause the offset to occur, thus increasing the time debilitation is active. Now, one thing we've talked about is the auto-exerting, giving them a base mana cost of 10. They're not supported by anything else, so that mana cost of 10 is always relevant. If you have blood magic, then obviously the mana cost doesn't matter, because whatever. If you didn't have a way of making their mana cost go away, that 10 mana is actually quite taxing. 40 mana every 2 seconds is a lot to deal with. So, we do something very simply by a quality life on a Elrion craft, the 7 to 6 non-channeling, pushes it to 8 when it's a 7 roll. This gets us the mana cost down to near nothing. Now, you combine that with the mana cost being split, okay, amongst the skills costing life, and just grabbing a mana mastery from a thing like Cannibalistic Rite, for example. This makes it so the mana part of the mana cost goes away in its entirety. I wonder if I can actually remove this and it stays. No, they still cost 1 mana then. Okay, we have to have that. I thought so. And this makes it so they just cost 2 life, which is hyper negligible. So, fantastic there. The fun interactions we were talking about earlier when it comes to some of the things the Warcries are doing automatically really bear fruit when it comes to the clusters. I just have a voice to set up just to show it on one little section. But realistically, you could just do like 2 sections here and 1 section there if you wanted. An armor section and a fizz section. There are like, I would say 6 relevant, Warcry things. One of them is enemies taunted by your Warcries are intimidated. Well, most things, the Warcries are taunting constantly, so that's cool there. A lot of them do different taunt things. This one also just does intimidating. So if you didn't have Intimidating Cry, you wouldn't need this, but if you want free Intimidate, that's an option. This one is Mob Mentality. This is probably the best one. They have a 5% chance of granting a charge per power, so when you have infinite power, they just always grant a charge. All charges, all the times, right? Who needs Relicash boots when you have infinite charges, right? Fantastic. If you want, it's pretty easy to get access to just like the frenzies and the endurances down here. You can always do things like anointing more or traveling farther. There's picking up power there, but that's why just sitting still, you're at max charges pretty much always, thanks to Mob Mentality if you have an infinite Warcry auto-exertion setup like this. Rattling Bellow is exerted attacks have an 8% chance to deal double damage. I'm pretty sure this one stacks. I don't know why it wouldn't stack, but all your attacks are exerted effectively as a slam build or a strike build in this circumstance because their exertion rate is so high so aggressively. Now this does nothing when we have Intimidating Cry active, but Intimidating Cry might not always be active, so this thing might have some relevance in that regard. Warning Call grants armor per power when you Warcry up to 100%. And again, when you Warcry is the correct verbiage for it to work. We know this because if you just stand, in an area like this, you could see our armor going up because the Warcries are being triggered, so the armor is increasing periodically. So moving on, we also have Lead by Example. This says when you Warcry, you gain Onslaught. Pretty simple. The Onslaught is longer than our cooldown of Warcry, therefore we always have it up. And the last one to really showcase here, I think, is the Cry Wolf. Increased power does nothing, but it's just 30% damage, so that legally is a thing you could use if you just need an additional prefix. That one does something. There's also a crit one, but I feel like typically builds this side of the tree are either going to be RT, or you're going to travel over and get Precise Technique. So, fun there. Now, there are a couple uniques that are relevant when it comes to Warcries, but really I think it boils down to just one, aside from the Red Blade banner, which we showed off, which is the Echoes of Creation. This is the helm that drops off of Uber Shaper, the Pinnacle boss. It has 2 interesting lines, I would say, maybe 3. One of them is really only relevant if you're not auto-exerting. The Warcries have additional cooldown is obviously relevant if you're going to be manually casting a Warcry. This means when I use my Ancestral Cry, I could Ancestral Cry again. It's not going to make me have 18 exerts, but it just means I'm basically doubling my CDR on something like this, if I chose to do that. If you're not manually casting it, that portion of the helmet basically does nothing. However, the other ports do stuff. So when you attack, taking physical damage, 20% of my life adds physical for each Warcry exerting the attack. Now, obviously, I'm exerting a cajillion attacks, right? I have 4 Warcries automatically triggering here. When I right-click, I take a big old chunk of damage. Now, that being said, because of my Mob Mentality, my auto-exerting, my Cry Wolf, my Lead by Example, all my stuff going on, I end up having a large amount of endurance charges with just using meager Chaos signs, right, plus whatever I'm using. This leads it so when I actually do attack, it's mitigating a tremendous amount of that damage. I have 80 plus physical mitigation with really no armor on the build whatsoever because of the amount of endurance charges I have. Now, the big thing is the fact that skills deal 15% more damage for each Warcry exerting them. For Warcries, 60% more damage. It's like getting an extra support and a half basically built into my thing. So, Echoes of Creation, probably just best in slot helmet, because it just gives you a tremendous amount of damage. Now, one thing we also talked about was the banner. There's a banner master that says you gain Valor when you Warcry, if able. We're Warcrying constantly, and we can only gain Valor if we don't have Valor, which leads us to being able to do a massive War banner pretty much whenever we want. You can do other banners, but I feel like War banner lends itself because it's a more Fizz multiplier with the kind of the rest of the Warcry Slam or Strike suite. So because of that, it feels really nice. Now, there's something you can use that's kind of funky if you really wanted to, although I personally wouldn't because I think it's kind of fucking stupid. You could do it is use the new Perfidy chest. So Perfidy has been changed for the 3rd time in my life to now have it so it has the line, having a banner does not prevent you from gaining Valor. So what does that mean? So quite simply put, if we were to use our banner, right, which has a duration because we have it currently linked to nothing more than nothing. If we linked it to more duration, it would last longer. We don't even need to, right? We have 105 Valor. This means our war banner is granting us like 40+% more to physical damage, okay, in accuracy. If we hit spacebar, our banner's active now for, what is that, 12 seconds. During that 12 seconds, we are actually still gaining Valor. Watch our Warcry gain Valor at a rate that's basically equal to the rate of our banner. We're already back at 100, and it's back down again. So what this means is, through this setup, and you could make this even a little bit better if you just did things like picked up these bottom nodes for increased Valor gain if you wanted to, you know, or Banner Man if you wanted to. But it just makes it so, or we can link it to the more duration gem, you'll have 100% uptime of whatever banner you want in any situation where you wanted that to happen. Now, the banner's AoE is huge. I believe it's this circle right here. So that's the banner circle right there. You can see this, it's basically screen wide, right? So if I'm casting this banner on this waypoint, the banner's actual AoE, and this is not linked to something like AoE, is like fucking the size of the entire screen. So basically, if I were to push this button every 20 seconds or so, you know, and you can, because it's going to have it suck it up, you could double tap it basically. It has a little bit of a cooldown. Have 100% uptime of whatever banner you want. Now, one of those banners gives you block, one of them gives you damage. They just do different things. But if that's something you cared about, sure, you could have 100% uptime of a banner for basically free. And that has a lot of benefits, basically the same benefits of having an extra support. You could do a lot of things like having the helmet or having the banner uptime that are artificially making your link damage go to like a 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 link, you know. So, a lot of fun things to be had there. But yeah, and there's things you could do to make your Warcrys a little bit better, like these tattoos, the Tukahamas of the Warcrawl. These are really rare, honestly, from boats, and just, I'm not sure the prices on trade, but in general, it's like, they're just quite rare. So a little bit hard to come by. This is what they look like if you're on the tree. Looks like that right there. You can have more of them, but you can see like my Warcry is at exactly 2 seconds. I put another one on, it goes to 2 point... Why the fuck did it go up? Was it on 3-second cooldown? I'm fucking confused now. Right, now it's back to 2 seconds. Okay, I don't know what the fuck just happened there that made that cooldown increase dramatically. Why did the cooldown go from 2 seconds to 2.9 seconds by gaining CDR? Alright, I don't know what's happening there, but that seems like voodoo. Maybe I'm misunderstanding something, but that doesn't seem right. Anyway, yeah, TLDR, Warcrying is really cool, and there's a lot of cool stuff you could do with it that lends itself to playing any Slammer Strike build and gaining a lot of value, artificial value, out of a setup that might normally cause you carpal tunnel. You could actually do a lot of damage with like a pretty goofy setup, you know, if you wanted to. So say I take something like, I'll just take a level 1 Ground Slam, put it in an Autoexert here, okay? And I have, obviously, like, I'm just using a 2-link Tidebreaker. Oh, it has Endurance Charge on Stun built in. Okay, you know, that's something, sure. But I just have random gear on. The Mage Blood is literally doing nothing. This is more just showcasing. I just needed the stats to showcase, like, what you could do in this situation. Sure, let's just grab this random Sepulcher. I have no idea what this old Atlas tree is, but we're doing it. So yeah, there's like a lot of like, you know, you could watch the DPS kind of start to skyrocket and climb as I stand here. There's a lot of goofy stuff that you could have with these setups that give you such amounts of damage artificially because of your attacks being exerted and all this kind of hoopla around it. So even on like a 2-link setup that doesn't read the damage properly, I'll be able to effectively one-shot most of these mobs in this map as I just walk through. With a lot of these, you know, things are level 1. It's just like, you get like such a crazy amount of value from just exerting to this extent that you could, there's a rare. Yeah, look at him go. Here's my banner. I'm bannering. You can kind of put 2 and 2 together here and just see like what could be, you know, for a setup that isn't level 1 gems and not a 2-link, etc. It's kind of crazy how much value actually you can gain from these auto-exertion setups. That's not terrible. I really wish we could somehow get that 15% life on the mastery, but unfortunately that's just like off the table. But, you know, a little bit of life on kill, a little bit of regen, and kind of covers your bases. Either way, that's like pretty much all I wanted to show off there, was just that, like, even on a very minimal setup, you get a tremendous amount of damage and value because you're just generating the endurance charges, all the charges, the onslaughts, the overexerts, the double overexerts, the double damages, the more AoEs, all the fucking shit you just got going on here. It just is a crazy amount of value for a very basic setup. Yeah, I'm sure I missed something when it comes to overexertion, auto-exerting, and warcrying. I think this is a pretty good foyer into the basics of it. And again, any slam skill, any strike skill kind of works for these sort of setups that would lend itself to this framework, I would say. Whether you're a chieftain, or you could be a juggernaut or a berserker, there's a lot of different avenues you could take that will kind of yield similar and positive results. So that's that. That's my little TED Talk. If you have any questions, feel free to ask them in the comments below. Have fun playing PoE. And yeah, if you have anything to add, let me know. All right. Bye-bye, guys.